Hello, I'm Kat Sarfas, forever bookseller at Barnes & Noble. Today we are joined by the lovely Ava Reid. Ava is the author of the highly acclaimed and best-selling The Wolf and the Woodsman and Juniper and Thorn. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me on. Really excited.
Many of us, included myself, fell in love with you and your writing, reading The Wolf and the Woodsman. Which became quite a darling on the TikTok scene. So there's a lot of fire and passionate fandom there. What was that experience, or what has that experience been like for you, because you're still living in it, particularly around your debut?
Well, it's funny. I'm not on TikTok at all, so I really only experience it secondhand when my friends send me these TikTok videos that they see on their feed on my book. It's very sweet. So I got a perfectly, tailored, watered down experience of TikTok that's very pleasant. And I'm insulated from a lot of the kind of negative things that go along with that. So it's been nice, but I think most authors who are doing their second books feel similarly in that it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because you have so many people who enjoyed your debut and you want to, you want to speak to that same audience and you want to hopefully, replicate the success to some degree, but you also want to grow as a writer. And, you're never going to be able to please everyone. And I think when there is such a powerful expectation from readers, it does feel like a lot of pressure, especially because Juniper and Thorn is quite different from The Wolf and the Woodsman. So I would say a blessing and a curse. It's really nice to see that some people's enthusiasm about The Wolf and the Woodsman has really carried over from Juniper and Thorn, and people have really, so far, shown up for it in a really amazing way.
I mean, I would say when I talk to a lot of authors, and especially people who are in it, it definitely feels like more of a positive experience. I think, yes, there's just a lot, but to your point, there's now that expectation, which kind of sets the bar. I'm sure when readers come to Juniper and Thorn, they're not going to be disappointed. It is. And I love that it's sort of, in that same world. So it's just like, you're just continuing that love that you sort of got from that first read. So retellings, speaking of, what's going crazy on Book Talk right now, so these retellings, reimaginings around fairy tales, mythology, folklore, classics. So they're all really having this moment right now, which is really wonderful to see the excitement for these titles. What is it about these stories that sort of capture the imagination and keep us coming back?
I thought a lot about this because The Wolf and the Woodsman has been called a fairy tale retelling, which it isn't really. But I'm okay. I'm okay with that. But with Juniper and Thorn, I set out to write a fairy tale retelling, and so I really actually became very obsessed with this idea of what makes a good fairy tale retelling and why they're currently so successful in the industry and publishing. And what I think I can say is that we come to stories that are familiar to us, and we want to see these, motifs and themes and symbols kind of reoccur. But at the same time, I think fairy tales are almost by definition things that do not conform to, modern conceptions of storytelling. There are really no characters as we would kind of think of them today. There are archetypes, but there aren't really characters, and those are two different things. So I think there's a ton of room for reinterpretation. I think that's a huge part of the appeal, is just the ability to really take something that at the same time is this huge, something that's so enormous in our culture and so well known, then also put your own spin on it in a way that can be really, really compelling, and with tools that, we have as modern authors that, these storytelling tools that didn't exist in the past, and ways of thinking that didn't really exist in the past.
I think it's interesting when you were talking just now about characters. particular, I think, even within mythology, within folklore, within fairy tales, perspective, and oftentimes that sort of female perspective is just interesting. We'll just leave it at that. Or it's just, it's obviously a lot of these stories were kind of told from a different perspective, from a male perspective. And it's just kind of seeing these characters almost get their due, or to be fleshed out in a way that just sort of the modern readers are interested. It's thinking of like Penelope. I mean, how many, like, she is such a compelling character, but she's very sort of one-dimensional, and you kind of, she is what she is. And then, there's all these now sort of reinterpretations of who she was and expanding her story. And I mean, that's just one example. I mean, they've been done within fairy tales, within folklore and such not. And it is really interesting to be able to say, yeah, the story was great, and I loved it when I was younger. But I always wanted to know what happened to that character. I always, there was always more to that. And to your point, kind of using fresh voices, new tools to sort of explore that. So yeah, I think it's just really exciting. And I think, your exploration of that in Juniper Thorn is really wonderful. So in both on the Woodsman and Juniper Thorn, you sort of weave, talking about mythology, so you sort of weave this beautiful tapestry. You got, ancient magic, there's historical fantasy, folklore, with religious and cultural tensions sort of, woven in. You tackle politics, identity, xenophobia. So what is it about fantasy, or these sort of mythological retellings that offers up this sort of perfect canvas to explore these stories? And I have a second part to that. I'm kind of dying to know the research that brought you to them, but let's just go. Let's start with the first.
Okay. So. I was thinking about this a lot last night because I kind of figured this might come up in the interview. And I think one of the hallmarks for a long time of fantasy has been a sort of timelessness. And you hear that term applied to fantasy a lot, like, oh, this feels so timeless. And so much classic fantasy exists in this sort of timeless state where, whatever fantasy world it's set in has kind of always existed, and it's always been there. And, it, with the assumption that it will always continue to be. And that's something that I've always been really interested in, kind of disrupting that and kind of setting my books during periods of like enormous change and upheaval. Like, I'm really interested in the idea of a fantasy world that has not always been the same, because that's not how the world works. And
yes,
kind of taking apart these things that are really taken for granted in fantasy, like this idea that, oh, there's this country full of, green people, and green people come from the Greenland, and they all have the same exact beliefs as each other, and they all have the same relationship to their identity, and this state has always existed, and it's kind of this like natural thing that has grown out of the earth. And that's really not true. And states are created, through very different means and through violence. And that's something that I don't see too often. I'm not going to, say that I'm the only person that has ever explored this, far from it, but I think that I didn't see that too much in fantasy. So I was really interested in exploring that, and really interested in kind of exploring the marginalized within that, right? Because when you're building a state and you're crafting an identity, inherently it's going to be somewhat exclusionary. So I became really interested in writing from that sort of marginal perspective, which again, I don't think is done, in my opinion, as much as it should be in fantasy. And I think there's just something really fascinating and compelling about upsetting the sort of timelessness of fantasy as a genre.
I love that. Yes, all of that. Okay, so then that second part, what was the research that brought you here?
I actually started like almost backwards when I was thinking about The Wolf and the Woodsman, where what got me interested in Hungary is actually modern Hungarian politics, and kind of the complexity of modern Hungarian identity, and kind of how you can see the threads of both Christianity and, this pre-Christian religion woven into contemporary Hungarian identity. And that's true for, a lot of countries in Europe, very, very true in Eastern Europe in particular. And, nationalism in Eastern Europe is very heavily tied to these pre-Christian traditions and kind of this neo-paganism. So that was really fascinating to me. And then I kind of looked back and I started, reading about this period of history and kind of the transition from, pre-Christian paganism to, Christianity, and how that completely aligns with the creation of, what we would call the modern Hungarian state. So I started actually from the present, and then I looked kind of backwards, which I don't know if that's, kind of a normal method of world building, but that's what I did.
I think a lot of times when, we're living, this is the time we're in, and it is sort of that curiosity of how did we get here? History inevitably repeats itself. And so kind of to be able to go back and say, where did this start? And then, and see all those threads that then, bring us here, continue to cause problems or continue, to shake up these systems. So aside from the folklore and the mythology, which there's so much there, there's a lots of very dark Gothic and horror elements swirl throughout Wolf and Juniper. So Gothic literature was probably my first true love. And so I have to ask, what are your Gothic inspirations? What were your Gothic inspirations?
One of my favorite books in the world is We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. And I think the influence is very clear if you've read that book, and obviously if you've read Juniper.
Yes.
Shirley Jackson is absolutely my biggest kind of writerly inspiration. And when I first started thinking about doing a retelling of the Juniper-Tree, I started thinking about what makes it so disturbing to people, because it kind of has this unofficial title, oh, this is the darkest Grimm's fairy tale. And I was like, okay, well, why? You have violence against children in a lot of fairy tales. You have a lot of, even Red Riding Hood, the grandmother is eaten by a wolf and then the wolf is disemboweled. I'm like, that's horrifying. That's so messed up. But you don't hear that, called a dark fairy tale. Hansel and Gretel, you have this kind of cannibalism aspect, but you don't typically hear this being, this doesn't get the kind of title of darkest fairy tale. I was like, so what is so disturbing about this fairy tale? And I really think that it is the intimacy. It's the fact that these horrible violences are going on within a single family. It's, these relationships that are supposed to be so intimate are actually so incredibly fraught and so, threaded with violence. And that's what's so disturbing to people. And once I kind of thought about that, I was like, well, this retelling can't be an epic fantasy like The Wolf and the Woodsman. It has to be, a tight, contained setting. It has to be a Gothic horror, because it's really just a fairy tale about domestic abuse. And I don't think that, at least I couldn't make that work as an epic fantasy. I had to kind of put it in a Gothic setting, and that makes sense to me. And I think that to me feels like it's carrying the heart of the original fairy tale, even if obviously I've taken plenty of liberties.
Yes, I think, no, it is definitely, when you get into Juniper and Thorn, I feel like the tone and the atmosphere is sort of set right away. And you do have this almost like this pit in your stomach, when you're reading these characters and the father, and you're just like, oh, this is not going well. It is true. When you go back to the original, I think, we're obviously, lots of fairy tales have been watered down through time, and how we're sort of first introduced to them usually is in that sort of watered down version. And then when you go back and you read them, it is sort of who gets the award for the worst mother, worst father. Juniper and Thorn and The Wolf and the Woodsman. So they take place, so they're obviously different times and places, but they are both set in the same world, this world that you've created. So what is your favorite thing about this world that you've created?
This sounds maybe oversimple, but I wanted to create a world with actual diversity, because I was reading a lot of Eastern European fantasy, and so much of it is so great. As a Jewish person from Eastern Europe, I never saw this kind of element of like the actual like ethnic diversity of Eastern Europe, and the cultural diversity of Eastern Europe. And you kind of saw these like blank, wintry foresty settings. And I think that that's like very the stereotypical, depiction of Eastern Europe. And I wanted to kind of, and obviously that exists, and there's a reason why that's so salient because that is a lot of, what Eastern Europe is, and particularly Russia. But Hungary and Ukraine both are geographically quite different. They don't have the same, flora and fauna. And also all of Eastern Europe is and has historically been home to these like indigenous ethnic minorities. There's Jews, there's Roma, there's Tatars, there's all these people that don't get represented in fantasy because it's like, it's either this kind of active bias or it's just like this lack of knowledge and, an unconscious bias. And I was like, well, why can't I create a fantasy world that at least attempts to kind of represent, the actual diversity of Eastern Europe in a way that, a lot of this mainstream, like Eastern European fantasy, like didn't quite do it for me. So I wanted to do something kind of different, and I wanted to represent, my family's history as well that I didn't see reflected there, and how influential, Jewish culture actually has been over, in Eastern Europe in ways that are, both actively being erased and, unconsciously ignored.
Speaking of those cultural tensions, and what they've gone through in a way, all these sort of these different minority groups and how they've had to sort of live and, adapt. And it's, and I think particularly in, Juniper and Thorn and the father, like his xenophobia, like his, like just right off the bat, and how he speaks to all these minorities. And it is very telling, and it's obviously timely because it's, something that sort of we're still very much entrenched with, but to see that it goes back and how it's been this struggle, it's been this consistent way of life for so many people in that region, the historical contents, and just sort of those, fantasy is so political, and being able to sort of have that canvas for that is just very, very interesting. I feel like you get like the fantasy and you get a history lesson sort of wrapped up. And then maybe that goes back to why, I think why there's so many fans of this sort of genre. I think it's nice to sort of be able to play in a way, but then also sort of absorb and learn something new, have that representation, have that mirror, whatever you want to call it. So you created this world, wanting, what your favorite parts of it. So now, so you have 2 books in this world. Do you have plans for future stories sort of set in the same space?
Not at the moment, no. My next book out will actually be my young adult fantasy debut in September 2023, which I'm really excited about. And that's kind of a dark academia, literary mystery thriller, still figuring out the elevator pitch on this one. Like the fantasy version of Possession by A.S. Byatt, which is one of my favorite books ever.
Very nice.
So I'm really excited about that. No plans right now for future books set in the world, but I would love to return to this world at some point. And I think that there's so much that could still be done and can still be explored, and a lot of, things that I'm interested in digging into. Speaking of YA,
there is so much crossover between I don't know, you want to call new adult fantasy, YA. I kind of feel like a lot of the readers, it's just they devour books, devour series. I think we're just sort of hungry for these epic stories, these fantastical, call them retellings. It's just this great space to kind of explore different themes. What interested you in YA and kind of making? I mean, again, there's so much crossover, but that slight leap, that jump, how was that?
So it's interesting. I feel like I'm like a very early Gen Z / late millennial. Depends on who you talk to.
I remember what like age chart. I love those. It's like this one's like, no, it starts at 1996. It's like, well, it starts this time. Yeah, I get you.
So yeah, either one. But I kind of feel like I quote unquote came of age in like the golden age of YA. Like I remember reading Twilight, reading The Hunger Games, reading like The Hunger Games is absolutely like what got me interested in writing original fiction, because up until then I was just writing fan fiction, which also like I feel like I grew up in such a great time period for fan fiction. And I know so many of my friends who are the same age as me like cut their teeth writing fan fiction and like these online forums. And I think that you see that coming through so much in like the YA that's popular right now, which is really awesome. The amount of friends that I've actually, bonded with over like the fact that we wrote Warrior Cats fan fiction when we were 11 on like fanfiction.net, like is amazing. It felt like very normal to me. I wanted to write something for, for teens and for my teenage self that I would have, loved to read when I was a teenager. And I think that's a very, very different task from writing adult fiction. And and it takes some, considerations. And there were definitely moments when I was writing A Study in Drowning, my YA debut, when I actually felt the real fork in the road where I was like, I can go this direction and that will make it an adult book. But I'm going to choose to kind of go this direction to make it YA. But I think that it's very I felt a very different sense of responsibility when I was writing the characters, because obviously in, Juniper and Thorn, Marlinchen goes through some very, very horrible things. And not that I think that these things have no place in YA. I absolutely, disagree with that. But I felt like I needed to give readers a little more reassurance in my YA book that like there would be a soft landing, and I wanted them to kind of trust me more as an author.
Interesting that you talked about fan fiction, because I actually had that. I had like on my list of things to discuss, because there are so many like, the millennial and Gen Z, or, millennial / Gen Z, wherever bucket you sort of put yourself in, writers who kind of got their first, whether it was like taste for writing, cut their teeth, they got the start. It was fan fiction. It's interesting to hear you say that. I was actually going to ask you if you had is there any fan fiction floating out there in the universe that you either never want anyone to read, or you, or that you want to talk about? It was such a way to sort of express yourself and, and kind of get those juices flowing, those writing, inspiration.
Yeah, definitely. And I honestly think that like a big part of why retellings are so popular is because like they follow a similar logic to fan fiction, where it's like you feel this kind of dissatisfaction with the current canon and you want to like quote unquote fix it fan fiction. I remember it was so popular where it's like, this ending was so horrible, I can't believe they did this to this character. This is my fix it fan fiction where my favorite character is going to get justice, within the narrative. So I think that same mindset really, exists when it comes to these retellings. Which is really interesting. There's definitely, no idea if it's still, around archives somewhere. There's definitely the Warrior Cats fan fiction, definitely some Hunger Games fan fiction. I think fan fiction is awesome. And I think it's really cool that we're in this kind of place where we can acknowledge how influential it's been on like the current canon in SFF and in romance as well. In genre romance, you really see that a lot too, which is cool.
I think at one point it's nice to see that it's getting a little bit more recognition. I feel like even when I was younger, it was like, I remember kind of, I loved Lord of the Rings fan fiction. Like that's where I wanted to be, and just sort of like devoured all those stories. And like also like the art, it wasn't necessarily mainstream. It wasn't necessarily something that, that like, you read it and maybe, you talk to people where you knew you were in like a safe space where you're like, these are my other fellow fan fiction. Yeah. Now there are so many, outlets, and people are just writing it up, like getting it out there, like you were saying, like fix it, essentially give the characters the story and the ending that they deserve. versus what the fans want. And I feel like there's sometimes, I think those definitely butt heads, but so it's interesting when you talk about like that fix it, because it's sort of like, yes, obviously, the fans, and they want to see certain characters sort of evolve in a certain way, but at the same time, it's like, well, there's from the writer's perspective, there's a reason, and thought given into why, these characters have the arcs that they do. So I guess.
And one of the things that I really like specifically wanted to do with Juniper and Thorn was like, because I was always the type of person in fandom who like the characters that everyone else hated for being like weak and like whiny and like annoying, like those are always my favorite characters. And like those are kind of like the side characters, and like I don't know, I always like I felt so defensive of them. So I wanted to write that kind of character, the kind of character who you usually don't see as the protagonist, who's not like, she's not like snarky and like cool. She's not, super powerful. She's not, and there's nothing wrong with those types of characters. They can be super empowering and like really fun to read and write about. But I wanted to do something really different and like honor those characters that are kind of like...
Yes, give them a chance to shine. When you're writing, when you're exploring fan fiction, it is opportunity to, like you said, explore those characters that are not the typical protagonists, not what everybody sort of thinks they want to see. But it's not until you read the other side that you kind of say, like it was interesting to explore, and that's. Again, I'm not going to give away too many spoilers, but that's exactly, in Juniper and Thorn, that, our main protagonist is not, I think in the beginning, even I myself was sort of like, okay, like, come on, girl, like, get a little, like, you got to, like, build yourself up a little bit here. But then, obviously understanding her circumstances don't necessarily, or very much depict who she is. But I think there are so many people to explore it, so many different personalities. I think being able to sort of depict different facets of humanity, of who we are, and let everyone kind of have that moment. It's interesting, and it's just fresh perspectives, and being able to step in someone else's shoes for a time. It's refreshing, and I think that's why we all love fantasy so much. I love to ask people what they're reading, but I'm going to take it back for you, because again, I've heard you numerous times talk about your original love, which is what you were saying before, and you were talking about fan fiction, is the Warriors, which I think so, because like that series will never go away. Like it's going to live forever. Yes. So I think it's so funny when you hear people talk about, how they the early stages, and now it's just kind of evolved into this whole nother world. I don't even know what spin-offs, and there's so many, just like the trees and branching off and whatnot. So tell us about your earliest sort of fantasy, in a way, like grimdark fantasy.
Those books are really dark. Like,
yes, inspirations. It's funny that there's so many books that they live in sort of that young reader space that, much like fairy tales, when you actually read the original forms, they're a lot darker. I think when you're a child, you're just it's easy to just sort of accept what you're reading, and then when you get older, you're like, why was I? Maybe I shouldn't have been reading that. But yeah, so I would love for you to wax poetic on your love for all things Warriors.
Yeah, it's actually really funny. So my editor for my YA stuff, she is actually the one who now edits these like Warrior books, because they're under the same imprint. So like during the auction for the book, I was like, full circle. Yeah, I was like, it has to be Stephanie. Like, this is just too perfect. Like, I literally like texted my mom, because she was the one who, like, when I was like 10, we would like go to Barnes and Noble, and like she would buy me the book, and I would literally read it on the way home while I was walking, like bumping into telephone poles, like finishing it by the time I got home. I mean, for every writer, there's like that book that like made them a reader and also kind of made them a writer. And for whatever reason, those were the books for me. And like I said, they really are quite dark, and they have a pretty like you know, they're morally complex. They have a complex society. It's really interesting. I remember being like so devastated by the deaths in those books. Like, I can't, like, it was my first experience being so engaged in like a piece of media in a way where, like, because I was so engaged and because I was so like upset, I was like, I have to do something with all these emotions. I have to fix it somehow. Like, when my favorite character died, I was like so
End,
like nothing, no like two deaths in fiction have upset me more than Feathertail from the Warrior Cats and Finnick from the Hunger Games.
Those are it. That was like, you can, you know, there are
Like,
those moments in
nothing.
childhood
Yeah.
that like, you know, where it's like, you know, like this happened and I was forever changed. And those,
yeah, I
don't underestimate the power of a character death, especially when you're so impressionable. Yes.
Yeah, which is a reason why I don't like to write character deaths, because I know how like infuriating almost it can be for the reader and just like how upsetting. So I really like to, I don't know, make sure that if I do kill a character, it's for a very good reason.
I think people, they do get very attached to covers, to packages of the book. So I have my reader copy of Juniper and Thorn. This is like stunning. And it kind of just like grabs you and like it's just so fascinating, and I'll pick it up and I'll happen to like glance and I'll see something in the cover that I didn't even notice the first time. Were you involved in that process, or you were saying like it's really sort of important to you? So how did this come about?
So I had a very, very specific vision for this cover in mind from the beginning. I even had like the artist picked out in my mind. I literally sent my editor a literal PowerPoint presentation of exactly what I wanted the cover to look like. I'm like, I want it to be like an Art Nouveau design because it's set in the Victorian period. I want it to have this kind of like really eerie effect. I want it to be kind of like not busy, but very like ornate and elaborate, because I think the prose style of the book is very elaborate and ornate. So I like put all these pictures together in PowerPoint, and I like, you know, wrote all this down. And then I was like, this is the artist I want you to hire. I put a bunch of their work in the PowerPoint, and I got really, really lucky that my editor just listened to everything I said. And they ended up hiring the artist, Marlo Loon, who's amazing. And
it really is.
Yeah, they're absolutely incredible. Their work is amazing. And they completely understood what I was going for with the book. And we had actually like so many really deep and great conversations about kind of the themes of the book and like how that could be reflected in the art. And like, I cannot believe how well they did in like capturing Marlinchen. It's just perfect. It's like everything I wanted from a cover. And I'm really, really lucky that my vision was executed.
I love that. I love that you're like, I have a mood board. Here it is.
Yeah, literally. I was like,
really, it. I mean, because these are these aesthetics that you know, draw people in. I mean, obviously, you know, I'm not going to be the one to say you judge a book by its cover, but it is something that sort of draws you in. And then what you were saying before, just these memories, you know, of the book and how, you know, how we sort of connect with them. And this cover is stunning. And so, yeah, I had to, when you mentioned that, I was like, oh, not to mention, I had to talk about the cover. What was the last book that you read that really just blew your mind?
So I have a couple. I've been on a really good reading streak lately. So I read Matrix by Lauren Groff, which was amazing. Yes. I just like to call it Medieval Nun Simulator, which is awesome.
Love it.
Really, really good book. And I also read an early copy of Our Crooked Hearts by Melissa Albert, which is amazing. It's just one of those books where like you want to reread it because you feel like you're going to get something so different about, like every time you read it, you feel like it's going to be like a unique experience because there's so much thought and care put into weaving these threads into the imagery. And I mean, I don't need to sing Melissa Albert's praises because everyone knows how amazing she is. But this book was like it was a trip, but it was incredible. Yeah, so those two. And I just downloaded Spear by Nicola Griffith, which I'm really, really excited about, which is like an Arthurian retelling. And I'm absolutely loving the boom of like Arthurian mythology kind of retellings. I think it's awesome.
Right. Yeah, that was like, when I saw that one, again, these retellings were, you know, kind of, there's so many buckets to it. So it's like, you know, you can have, it's like a buffet, you know, you get your mythology, you have your fairy tales, and there's even like the classics. And yeah, and then when I saw that, I was like, now this new boom in Arthurian legend, so multifaceted, so many worlds to explore, so many characters to re-explore, that, you know, finally get their due. So really wonderful. Juniper and Thorn, everyone. This book is amazing. The Wolf and the Woodsman, amazing. Ava, thank you again. This has really been wonderful. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us. The Wolf and the Woodsman. Yeah, The Wolf and the Woodsman. And Ava's newest book, Juniper and Thorn, are out now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello, readers. Welcome to another edition of the TBR Top Off, where we recommend books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Juniper and Thorn. I'm Mark, coming to you from my Barnes & Noble home store in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I am joined by my book buddy, Becky. Hello, Becky.
Hello, everybody.
So we've got a couple of books to go over today. I'm going to go ahead and jump right in with one of my very favorite authors. This is a book called The Empress of Salt and Fortune by the amazing Nevo. Nevo was a guest on a previous episode of Poured Over, and I think it's pretty common knowledge that I am mildly obsessed with her. She's incredible. So this is a Hugo Award-winning short novel. It basically is a 2,000 plus page epic told at 100 pages. I love it so much. She creates this sense of place and time and a government and a magic system and an environment that just feels so lived in that when you are plopped into this very, very short story, you're on board right away. It kind of feels like she approached this well that's filled with Asian folklore and mythology. She dropped a bucket in, pulled it up, sifted through it a little bit, and then just poured the story right onto the page. It's stunning. So this is the first of the Singing Hills cycle. The second book is out now, and the third book will be coming out this fall, I believe. And it follows the cleric Chi and their very adorable bird companion. And their job is to travel the countryside researching stories. So this installment takes them to a small, kind of rundown, creepy-ish village that might be haunted, and they listen to and transcribe the story of a fierce empress, from her political marriage to her exile and ultimately to her vengeful rise. It's fantastic. It is full of romance. It's full of palace intrigue. It is queer and magical and transportative. And it's just about stories within stories within stories. I want these books to always be available and to continue for the rest of my reading days. And I hope you feel the same. So please check out The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nevo.
Oh, I definitely will.
Yes, please do it.
Well, and you just keep raving about her so much that I need to read something of hers.
Do a deep dive.
Well, I might just have to take a week off and yeah. So I love that you chose actually the first installment of a series, because I did the same.
Great.
I went with Cinder by Marissa Meyer.
Oh, yeah.
So this is just a YA kind of steampunk retelling of Cinderella. And it's set in a futuristic China, dystopian China. And we meet Cinder, who is a 16-year-old cyborg mechanic. And she's actually a pretty cool character. I like her a lot. She meets her prince very early on. And so you kind of get that story going right off the bat when the prince brings his android in for repairs.
Oh,
so
cute.
Exactly. It's adorable. But of course, they have a lot working against them. One person, of course, is her evil stepmother. And her stepmother, though, it's interesting. She really treats Cinder as, because she's part cyborg, she is considered less than. So, and she's also considered property versus a person. So it's interesting kind of the dynamic that happens there and how the stepmother is treating her, and then kind of the liberties that are taken as far as what then we make Cinder do that you would never ask a person to actually do. So there's a little bit of interest there. I will say I did like this in this retelling that they did what they did in Ever After, where one of the evil stepsisters is not evil. And she treats Cinder as a sister, as a friend. I love Ever After. If you haven't seen that movie, it's another Cinderella retelling. And just shout out to Melanie Linsky because she's just the best stepsister ever. I just adore her. Anyway, I'm just going to gush. But Cinder does the same thing. It's wonderful that at least Cinder does have a few people that are friends, and that she's just not all by herself. So this is, like I said, the first of a series. It's the first of the Lunar Chronicle series. And in this book, it really sets up the rest of the series because there is, of course, a big bad beyond just the evil stepmother. There is the evil, I guess, the villain is Queen Levana from Luna. And Luna is basically a moon planet that is right by Earth. I think it's still Earth. And so, but there's going to be some fighting that is hinted at here, started here. But like I said, the rest of the series will then take you the rest of the way. So Cinder by Marissa Meyer, please pick it up.
Oh, yes. I like it. So we've got some retellings to tuck onto your pile. Thank you all for listening and watching Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode. My name is Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester, and you can do the same for Becky.
Hi, everybody. Yes.
Yes. Thank you all. Happy reading and have a wonderful day.
Please enjoy.
Bye.
Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. The show is available on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. Please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts.